Thank you, Raj, for your introduction, and good morning to all of you. It's really my pleasure to echo Dr. Raj Rasasingham's welcome and to thank all of you for joining us today, both of you in the room and those of you attending via the remote webcast. So, as a psychiatrist, I would say about 80% of the patients I see need some form of psychosocial intervention, but most of them, unfortunately, cannot get it. So many people in this room know that I'm deeply preoccupied by this lack of access and also, unfortunately, the lack of high quality for some people who have access, at least in Ontario. And I believe that we can work together to address this issue. And so today we are very fortunate because our speakers are really leaders who have developed new models of care to better serve our patients. And so this conference has been created to offer us an opportunity to learn from them. And then I hope that we can consider how we can apply their innovation locally. So it's not just to be inspired, but it's really, in my hope, it's a call of action. So I look forward to hearing from them, and I believe we'll have a terrific day. And I want to also acknowledge, like Raj, that it has been possible because of the work of several people. So first, Dr. Rasasingham, and who has worked a lot for this, and I want to acknowledge it. And he mentioned we have at the door showing Paula Ponick, perfect timing, and their colleague for the administrative quote. And before I introduce Dr. David Gratzer, for my own interest, looking at you, I would like to know how many of you in this room are a physician, RMDs? So it's actually a lot of them. And how many of you are on the PhD master track? So it's less people. So, what's interesting, it was not done, it's, I don't know if it's an unconscious bias, but I really hope that us physicians can remain involved in the work we're going today and that we don't devolve it entirely to our colleague PhD. It happened that the three plenary speakers are all PhDs. I hope that in future conference we have some moderator like Moline with an MD. I think the physician have something to contribute to that research and the conceptualization of this work. So I'm glad you showed up in number, and I echo what I said earlier. I hope that we all learn and we continue to do this work. This conference is sponsored by the Department of Psychiatry. We have a lot of psychologists and PhD rank, a couple hundred, so it's a lot, but I want us to continue to be involved and to lead that type of work. And we'll hear from David Clark, the experience in England, where the physician decided not to participate and therefore at this point are not involved, and I don't want that to happen to Ontario. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Gratzer, who is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. He's an associate chief at CAMH, where he's in charge of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health for Practice Innovation, so he's a perfect moderator for the first plenary presentation, and he will introduce our first speaker, David.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'll confess to being a little bit tired today. Yesterday evening, I had an animated debate with my middle child as to whether or not she should go to bed or should use her device to set a high score on her favorite video game. For those of you who have children of your own, or perhaps a nephew or niece or cousins, I think you're well familiar with the challenges of the boring option of going to sleep versus the very compelling option of video games. Devices offer us so much, and I would know because I dabble with social media myself. There's something very compelling about our devices and the programs that they offer with their high scores, with their leaderboards, and so on. One wonders, of course, if those of us who are trying to get patients better rather than just set high scores could marriage the attractiveness of these games, the principles of gaming, perhaps with therapeutic interventions. And in fact, our next speaker, Professor Gunning, is going to be speaking of exactly this. Professor Gunning is an associate professor of psychology at Weill, Cornell Medicine. She's also vice chair of the department, and she'll be talking about some of her work in this area and, of course, tapping into neuroscience. Professor?
Thank you for that introduction. I have my phone up here not so I can check my scores and compete while speaking, but just so I can make sure I don't speak for too long. So thank you for the warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here in Toronto. I have a fondness for the University of Toronto, although I haven't spent too much time up here. Benoit has had a positive influence on my career since very early, maybe about 15 years ago, as supporting me as a young investigator. And I also have a number of collaborators and friends here at the University of Toronto who I think are doing top-notch work. So thank you for having me. I don't have any specific financial disclosures. I have the good fortune that my work that I'm going to be presenting is almost entirely supported by the National Institute of Mental Health. I will say that Achille Interactive is a technology company that provides the platform for the therapeutic video game I'm going to present to you, but I don't have a specific financial tie to them. I do like them, and I think their product is really good, but there's no financial conflict. I want to thank my many collaborators at the beginning. Sometimes I get rushed at the end, and I forget the thank you. I've highlighted some of the collaborators here who have been the most formative in the work that I'm going to present. So George Alexopoulos, who's my mentor, longstanding mentor and now collaborator at Weill Cornell, he really set the stage for some of the initial work I'm going to present to you. Connor Liston is a collaborator who is focused a lot on using neuroimaging to identify reliable subtypes of depression in the service of assigning patients to the best treatment for them. And I do want to mention that we just this morning, we got a new grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to use neuroimaging to help us to guide the selection of treatment for depressed patients, and specifically with using neurostimulation, and that is a collaboration with the University of Toronto. Jonathan Downer is the co-PI on that grant, and that's a $7 million grant that Connor, Jonathan, and I will be embarking on together. So I'm very grateful. Toronto is also known by the National Institute of Health as very strong neurostimulation program. So the collaboration has been tremendously helpful already. The initial work I'm going to present to you is primarily with Pat Arian and Joaquin Angara, and then I do want to mention some of my postdocs and junior faculty who do a lot of the hard work. So they analyze a lot of the data and they recruit a lot of their participants. And also, of course, my chair, who is enthusiastic, will tell me when he thinks something is a bad idea, but is generally very enthusiastic and supportive about making changes in the field. In my role at Cornell, I do oversee psychology there, and more recently, I now oversee research there in the Department of Psychiatry. So I have pretty strong opinions about wanting to make what we do better for our patients, and not to criticize what we have been doing, but to make it more accessible and to figure out, for patients for whom our available gold standard treatments aren't working, or for patients for whom they can't access it, what can we do to try to make it better? So in the service of this, I primarily rely on neuroimaging and other like cognitive and affective behavioral tasks to try to advance and inform our treatments for depression and anxiety. I am a clinical psychologist focused on interventions, but I do focus on interventions that we believe are modulating brain networks involved in both cognitive and affective symptoms of depression. And again, relying on some novel treatment delivery approaches that broaden our reach and can improve our selection of treatments. And I will tell you before I start that I am a natural skeptic. So this first whole area of work I will tell you about, I did not think was going to work. And slowly over time, I have become a believer. I'll start off today talking about a neuromodulation approach using what is termed a therapeutic video game to target cognitive control dysfunction in individuals with depression. Then I will go and I'll talk about two neuroscience-informed psychotherapies targeting specific networks that we know are abnormal in depression. And then I'll end with some perhaps provocative future directions. So to start off with, why would we target the cognitive control network? So I have been studying the cognitive control network since 1993. When I first started graduate school. And when I first started studying it, it was studying it in normal aging. And the reason I studied it is because cognitive control and this network, which we called it something different 26 years ago, but it's still the same network. So cognitive control network is really important. It's comprised of the aspects of the prefrontal cortex, posterior parietal regions, working in concert really to help us to accomplish goal-directed behavior. And it's a superordinate system that controls processes like modulating affective responses. So this is a system that is important in pretty much everything we do. It's also a system that is quite sensitive to normal aging, which is why I first started studying it, because I was focused on normal aging. Dysfunction in this system is found across a host of both psychiatric and neurologic illnesses. We see it in psychosis, we see it in depression, we see it in many neurologic illnesses, multiple sclerosis, many neurodegenerative conditions. So it's not specific to depression, which is actually now one of the reasons I find it to be a very important treatment target. So if somebody has cognitive control dysfunction, they generally have trouble engaging in goal-directed behavior. In individuals with depression, this may look like difficulty initiating, starting their day, accomplishing tasks. Also susceptibility to interference from irrelevant information. So if you think about depression and you think about this tendency to have these intrusive, often negative thoughts that one can't shift away from, that may be a difficulty with the cognitive control system, and really trouble modulating other affective responses. You know, the long-standing view about at least a subset of depression is it really is driven, some of the mechanism in a very simplistic way is that there is an imbalance between more affectively responsive and basic limbic systems and the top-down modulation from the cognitive control system. So clinically, if the cognitive control system is disrupted, we call it executive dysfunction. And this occurs in approximately 40% of executive dysfunction is present in approximately 40% of older adults with major depression. And it also tends to persist even when the mood symptoms are treated. So I was taught early on by my mentor at Cornell, study something that's common. It's easier to get funded, and people will care more if it's common. And I actually agree with that. So I'll show you just some of our early data from Cornell, and this is from when I first began at Cornell. We did a clinical study in which people were taking people with major depression were taking antidepressant medication, and what we found, we gave them a simple bedside cognitive control task called the Stroop Task. It's a very common task where you essentially have to inhibit a prepotent response to read what a word says when it's in an incongruent ink color. So you have to ignore what it says, which is a very strong response, is just to read it and identify the color of the ink. And what we found from this simple bedside test is that individuals who are impaired on this task had a significantly lower response rate to antidepressant medication. We've replicated this in many samples using different antidepressant medication. This more recent study was using escitalopram, and we used a different analytic technique where we basically clustered people by their cognitive performance and found that in the executively impaired group, which is here, the probability of remitting with escitalopram was significantly lower than either in the reward-related group or the group that had impairment in reward-related functions, or in the group that was cognitively normal. This finding, and this probably isn't the complete list, this finding that cognitive control dysfunction is tied to poor antidepressant response, and that individuals with cognitive control dysfunction don't have a much lower likelihood of remitting or responding to antidepressant medication, has been replicated by many groups. So what I would say is this is a real finding, and it probably means something about our patients. We and other groups have examined the brain in relation to cognitive control in older depressed adults, and what we found here, what you can see in the brain, in the top panel, you see this is a resting state connectivity analysis, and you can see this is it basically shows connectivity among regions within the cognitive control network. So the dorsal anterior cingulate, bilateral, dorsolateral prefrontal, some parietal regions. When you compare controls in patients, you see down here in the middle frontal gyrus that there is a reduced connectivity in non-depressed individuals. And that what we do know is that the reduced connectivity that we see in older depressed adults is tied, and this is during the depressive state. What we do know is that this is tied to and related to executive dysfunction in daily life. It's also related to poor antidepressant response. So again, the message that I want to get across here is that, even when I was in training, so I would say in the mid-90s, when I was doing a lot of my neuropsychology training and seeing a lot of older depressed adults, and late 90s, what we thought for the longest time is that cognitive symptoms are just a symptom of depression. What we believe from the data that's accumulated over time is that it's not just a symptom in many individuals, it's actually a reflection of what is making that subset of individuals vulnerable to developing depression. The depression tends to be more treatment resistant, and the cognitive symptoms, the executive dysfunction, because it's not just a symptom of a depressed state, they do persist, and they're also tied to disability in daily life. So again, not just a symptom, but a core part of the illness. So because of this, at Cornell, we started focusing on two approaches. I will say when I started at Cornell, we were trying some pharmacologic approaches, and I'm a psychologist, so I'm naturally going to gravitate toward non-pharmacologic approaches, but we were doing pharmacologic interventions, some novel interventions, to try to treat this subset of individuals who weren't responding to antidepressant medication. And our pharmacologic studies didn't work, and primarily because some of the agents we tried, our patients simply couldn't tolerate them. over time, we did shift to more behavioral and cognitive interventions. So we've taken two main approaches. And when I say we, it's because any of you who work in do this kind of work where you're combining neuroimaging and novel interventions, it does take a village. It's not one individual doing the work. So we tried two approaches. One is, and this gets back to rehabilitation medicine. In my clinical life, I have been working in rehabilitation medicine since the early 90s, since I was in my graduate training. So there are two main approaches to rehabilitation and cognitive rehabilitation. One is that you teach people how to compensate, and the other is that you try to really remediate the deficit. And what I thought I knew from my rehabilitation training is that you can teach people to compensate for their weaknesses, but even if you do something that remediates their cognitive deficit, it doesn't transfer to other functions. So in that sense, it's not very useful. You can train them on a task, but it doesn't transfer into real life. So this is what I thought going into this. So the compensatory approach really is for people with depression and executive dysfunction that we took, was to do a rather large, not compared to David's work, but large for that time, multi-site trial using a gold standard treatment for older adults that was targeted for individuals with executive dysfunction, and it's a structured therapy called problem-solving therapy. And the other approach we took was a more direct cognitive remediation intervention designed to improve functioning of the cognitive control network. So these are the findings from the one set of findings from the problem-solving therapy trial. And so we can see here that 12 weeks of problem-solving therapy intervention in a randomized control trial that was done across 2 sites in collaboration between Cornell and the University of California at San Francisco. We can see that problem-solving therapy is better as far as it improves mood more, and that it also seemed to improve disability more than supportive therapy. Supportive therapy had an effect as well. The problem with this is that it didn't touch the cognitive symptoms. So their mood got better, but their executive dysfunction did not. And one of the issues with that is that because we know that the persisting executive dysfunction, first of all, it's reflecting some inefficiency in the brain, but that inefficiency in the brain is likely to lead people to relapse, along with the actual experience of executive dysfunction that's tied to difficulty performing in daily life and completing tasks. So it's a combination of the two. So it basically didn't touch the executive dysfunction. The other issue with this intervention is that it's really hard to train people to give. So this was a trial that was done at an academic medical center with expert psychotherapies who were already expert PhD level psychotherapies and who then received additional training. So I'll talk about our experience in the US. In the US, for older individuals on Medicare, good luck trying to get an expert psychotherapist. Every now and then I can sneak somebody in to see one of my psychologist colleagues, and it's mostly because I'm their boss. So the longer I've been in the field, the more this lack of access to care has bothered me. My experience in New York, again, is that older patients can't get access to treatment, and sometimes we can beg people to see them, and they will. And then the access to treatment they get, if they are lucky enough after 4 months of waiting to get into a clinic, is often not that powerful. So the other approach we took then is the more direct remediation of the cognitive control dysfunction. And I will tell you, after working in rehab medicine at that time for about 20 years, I did not think this was going to work. And it was a reluctant collaboration on my part. I liked the people at UCSF who were asking me to work on the grant with them, and I like to write grants. So I started off the collaboration and said, okay, I'll help with the grant. The grant, and I was slightly disappointed at the time the grant got funded on the first submission. And then I was like, oh, I was a young professor and I'm trying to get my own grant. I really didn't have time to work on it, and I didn't think it was going to work. So I tried to back out of the collaboration at least 3 times, very politely. Maybe I wasn't direct enough. I've become much more direct. But around the same time that we were finishing up that initial trial of problem-solving therapy, my colleagues at UCSF they were focusing on this cognitive intervention that essentially is a video game. And from their perspective, and they're cognitive neuroscientists with expertise in aging, and they very carefully designed a video game intervention to target one of the very deficits that older adults in normal aging struggle with the most, and that is something we call multitasking. So the ability to do multiple things at a time, essentially, which I've already noticed that I'm not as good at as I used to be. But it shows a steady decline with normal aging, unfortunately. So they combine their expertise in cognitive neuroscience of aging with basically gaming principles, and created an intervention. And I'll show you the initial version of the intervention. This was created by my collaborator Joaquin Angara and Adam Gazzali. The single task is essentially just responding to a circle. Sort of boring. I'll show it to you again. You have to assign, when the cross turns a certain color, you have to respond as quickly as you can to a certain colored circle, and you have to ignore another one. And then the multitask version of it is, my animation's not working properly, but the multitask version of it essentially was a driving game where you have to steer the car, and then at the same time you see these colored circles appearing, and you have to only respond to certain ones. So it has a motor component, and it also has a cognitive component. And combining the 2 different tasks is actually, they found to be quite important. So what you can see, looking, and not just taking my word for it, but what you can see is as people get older, everybody's performance decreases when you have to do 2 tasks at the same time. But this shows by decade of life how much it declines. So when you add a second task, in your 20s, on average in their group, they found that the performance declines about 27%. By the 70s, and this is in healthy individuals, it's about 63%. So what they did is they did a really elegant preliminary training study, and they trained people for 1 month on this sort of now clunky looking task I just showed you. You can see up top that the subject is sitting and looking at a laptop. And what they did is they compared people, they put them either in, they put the older adults in either in no contact control, the single task training, or the multitask training. And what they found is that with the multitask training, after 1 month of training for about 20 to 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, you could train the older individuals to perform at the same level as individuals in their 20s who were untrained. And that if you look at the graph here, you can see that this effect persists So this is after 1 month of training. 6 months later, you can see that at the MultiTask Training group, they retain that advantage, and that the single training reverts to, it's at the same level of no contact control. They also saw electrophysiology correlates of this. So what this shows is that they showed electrophysiology correlates related to the MultiTask training. They also showed transfer to other cognitive functions, not just the driving game. So other aspects of executive function. So this is the gold standard in cognitive training, is to transfer to other functions. So at that point, I still wasn't convinced about why this would work in depression, but I was interested. What they promised me, if I analyzed their FMRI data, what they promised me is if I remained involved in the grant, that I would get the psychotherapy data and FMRI data, and I could publish it. And I thought, oh, sure, they're nice people, and I didn't have psychotherapy and imaging data at that time. So then they did the initial proof of concept trial, and you can see this is the same, based on the same game, but at this point, some of the people from UCSF had started a company, and you can see that the game looks a lot nicer now. It looks like a video game. It's delivered on an iPad, and this is the intervention that's now owned by this company, Achille Interactive. And again, it looks just like a video game. It's engaging. Instead of having to drive a car on a laptop, you now are steering and avoiding hitting the walls. This is the motor component. At the same time, you have these different characters coming toward you, and you have to respond to some and ignore others. And it's adaptive. So it's individualized and it's adaptive based on the person's level of performance. It also has the gaming principles built in. So you level up, you get points, there are cool sounds. It's really engaging. When they came to train more recently, when they came to train my staff, my students were like, oh, this is the most fun we've had here at Cornell, which is, some of them had been there for like 5 years. So that may say something about how I run my lab, but it's really engaging. So when I became really interested, I still wasn't that interested because I didn't think it was going to work for depression. When I became really interested is after the initial proof of concept trial, and this small randomized control trial, what they found is when you compared mood symptoms in individuals who either did this 4 weeks of training at home with weekly non-psychotherapy coaching sessions, or they were assigned to the problem-solving therapy, and these are all people who were moderately depressed, older adults who were unmedicated. What you found is a non-inferiority of the video game, which is in orange. And the training ended at week 4, and so you can see the results at week 4, that on the depression rating, there's no difference. And then at week 8, there's still no difference, even though the individuals haven't been doing the game they only did it for 4 weeks, and they had 8 weeks of psychotherapy. And then what we saw is that in blue, it demonstrates the improvement in executive functions, the transfer to other executive functions. So even though the group's both groups' mood was improving to the same degree, only the video game, only the EVO intervention showed an improvement in cognitive functions. We got a very small signal on MRI data, because we were collecting that as well, but the sample's too small for me to make anything out of it, so I'm not going to show it to you. But that was enough for us to pursue funding from NIMH. And at this point, this is the best, so when you talk about transfer to other functions, cognitive training, not only did we show transfer to other cognitive functions, but the real transfer is to the mood function. So if you're, essentially the idea here is if you are enhancing the function of a disrupted cognitive control system that is driving some of the depressive symptoms, and you rescue that circuitry or remediate the functioning of that circuitry, the improvement in mood I see as definitely far transfer to other functions. Essentially, and I'll show you some data from our newer trial that suggests that this is due to an enhancement of the cognitive control system. So we, more recently, a couple of years ago, so at this point I'm all in, happy to write the grant, the second grant with them. And we did get an experimental therapeutics grant through NIH a couple of years ago to study. The first phase of it is just to study whether this intervention engages the cognitive control system. So this is just a description. We extended the age range down to 45. People all had had a major depressive episode. All had executive dysfunction. The idea being that if somebody doesn't have dysfunction in the system, the likelihood of, we don't actually think, we're not convinced this is going to work in individuals unless their system is dysfunctional. There are many pathways, biological pathways to depression, and cognitive control dysfunction in older adults is a very common one, but it's certainly not the only one. So we selected people for the dysfunction. We also this time took people who are on medication and were still depressed. So essentially this group was a little bit more treatment resistant than the first group. And also this time the trial was conducted, the first trial was conducted solely at UCSF. The second trial is being conducted at University of Washington and Cornell. So we, again, 4 weeks, 5 days a week, 20 minutes of training. We do shut off the iPad. It shuts off automatically after 20 minutes, so people aren't allowed to play for longer than that. And there are brief weekly meetings with coaches, primarily to monitor their mood symptoms. And we measured the cognitive control network pre and post-intervention. So we measured it in multiple levels. We measured it at the level of the brain using resting state fMRI, using task-based fMRI, using a Stroop Task. We measured it on similar paradigms they used initially, a working memory task, a standard task of sustained attention, and then we also measured it using self-report measures of executive dysfunction. I'm a neuropsychologist. I really like to measure a lot of things and measure them thoroughly. The idea being here, the way this trial is set up is it's a fast-fail trial. So if we didn't show that we were changing the cognitive control network with the intervention, then after the 2 years of funding, then the next 3 years, they would not give us funding for the randomized control trial. And we set our criteria very high. So our criteria, our DSMB told us it was too high. I'm stubborn. And said, they basically said, you may not see the change on imaging. And I said, well, if we don't see it on imaging, I don't want to do the randomized control trial. And the study team, my co-investigators, Pat Arian and Joaquin Angara, agreed. So first I'll show you what you can see here is that on the cognitive tasks, the first two panels are changes from pre to post evo. This is looking at reaction time on a working memory task. These are two different conditions of the working memory task. We did see a significant change and decrease in reaction time over from pre to post evo intervention. We also saw it on the TOVA, a standard clinical measure that's used of sustained attention, and we also saw it on self-report. So we saw it in our change in the cognitive domain. The other thing that we did is not just look at group differences, but what we decided that is on for our go, no-go criteria, that on the individual level, at least a third of our, not a third, at least 2/3 of our sample had to show greater than half a standard deviation of improvement on these various measures. That's what our DSMB told us to change, but we refused. We saw an improvement in brain connectivity from baseline to post-EVO. And on this one, you can see we did a resting state analysis where we put a seed here within the cognitive control network. And that basically just means we're looking at how synchrony in activity of the brain between these regions. And we saw an increase in connectivity with the middle frontal gyrus, which is a very important aspect of the cognitive control network. Interestingly, some of especially in older adults, like some of the work from Pittsburgh that Howard Eisenstein has done, what they've seen with antidepressant medication is that post-antidepressant medication, there is a normalization of focal activation in the brain, but the connectivity does not improve. So here we do see an improvement in the connectivity. We also saw when we connection and increased connectivity from the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to the superior temporal gyrus. And we see here, what I'm showing you here is that this improvement in connectivity is related to clinical change. So the greater the increase in connectivity, the greater the change on a measure of depression. And also the greater the change on self-reported executive skills. So it's not just the brain is changing, it does seem to be related to the clinical symptoms, both mood and cognition. We saw a similar effect, smaller, using task-based activation, where we just see this this increase in activation in what is typically a hypoactive dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in mid and late life depression. It's smaller, it's a task-based fMRI, it's harder to get a good signal, frankly. And finally, I just want to show you that we did see the mood symptom change. Again, the way the funding mechanism is, this is a single trial, single arm phase of the trial. So you can see from baseline to post-intervention that there's a significant change in depressive symptoms. And there's a big change in week 1. Some of this might be placebo. But it does continue to change, and there is a change from week 1 to week 4. I will mention here that our adherence in these trials is it's too good to be true, and in a larger sample, it probably won't be, but it's almost 100% that people really like this, and they're really motivated. So we do see people who they have had some treatments that might touch their depression and improve their depression. They're really concerned about their cognitive symptoms, and they often find the symptoms disabling. So the intervention is both fun. They don't have to come in on a regular basis, and it's motivating. So just to summarize this part, based on a deficit model in a subgroup of individuals with depression and cognitive control dysfunction, I do think we can use this type of cognitive training to rescue dysfunctional circuitry that may be the mechanisms for both mood and cognitive symptoms in a subgroup of individuals. Cognitive control dysfunction is really common in depression. In older adults, it's about 40% of individuals with depression, and in younger adults, the meta-analyses show it's about 20%. So this is not what we would call a rare subtype. And other subtypes or expressions of depression may be more responsive to interventions that are more targeted to their specific, phenotype. I do want to mention here that this intervention now has been tried, and some of it was simultaneous. I think we're the only group who has imaging data related to it to show a change in the brain. But it has been tried in other conditions now. So it's not just depression. There has been a large efficacy study done in ADHD. The company is pursuing FDA approval for this as a digital therapeutic for ADHD. And so I think part of the future, whether, and again, I'm not tied to their pursuits of that at all, but I do think this is where some of these, the cognitive interventions that work, I think this is the direction we're going in. And I think within a couple of years, there will be interventions out there, cognitive interventions that have been shown to be efficacious that can be prescribed. And that's the goal, because now people still ask me, oh, can I have access to this? I don't have access to it. I can access it to, to test it out and to train people, but the access isn't there yet, but I think it's coming really soon. Some of the other conditions for which this has been shown to be efficacious is things like multiple sclerosis, so some neurodegenerative conditions as well. I want to emphasize that I'm not going to, I don't have a strong opinion about specific other cognitive training methods. I think this one works for multiple reasons. It's engaging. It is really based in the neuroscience and targeting a deficit that we think is tied to many mood and neurologic symptoms, and it's individualized. So it's not a boring, repetitive intervention that nobody's going to do. So I think that the way this has been designed, I think they did it the right way, and I'm not taking credit for that. I just sort of went along for the ride and did the neuroimaging piece. So I want to skip to some of the, skip a little bit to neuroscience-informed psychotherapies. I think what I'm going to do, will somebody remind me what time I need to stop talking?
10:15, but we need time for questions. I'm sure what you're saying is challenging people and they want to engage.
So maybe 20 more minutes and then, okay, perfect. So I'm going to skip one of our psychotherapy approaches and I'm going to go to the one that we have more data related to it. So I do think neuroscience has also reached the point of being able to meaningfully guide psychotherapy development. And I'll show you one example of I'll skip through one, and I'll show you one example of one that we have developed at Cornell, and that's been in a collaboration again with the University of Washington with Pat Arian. So the theoretical assumptions about this is that, well, basically what we know about depression, this is an intervention for depression. We do know that dysfunction of the reward system, the ability to learn from rewards, to enjoy rewards, the pursuit of rewards, is central to many individuals suffering from depression. Like the cognitive training, now I think our data related to the cognitive training is stronger, that it really is probably based on a neuroplasticity model. But like the cognitive training, this psychotherapy is based on the premise that we can retrain dysfunctional reward systems, promote neuroplasticity, and through that mechanism reduce depression. And relying on neuroscience, so, and again, I'm a skeptic, so when we first started talking about this treatment, I thought, so I like neuroscience, I like thinking about how the brain's working, but why do we need it to actually help us refine some of our psychotherapies, beside it being an academic interest? So there are a couple of reasons, I think. One is I think it perhaps allows us for more distinct targets for psychotherapy. So if we know in an individual or a subgroup that they have inefficiency or disruption in their reward system, if we can give them a targeted psychotherapy to retrain that system, not only may we get better efficacy, but we may be getting at more at the root of, from a biological standpoint, of the disruption in their system. It also allows us, to maybe rely on some more targeted, easier to administer and train other people to administer, and simplified versions of psychotherapy. So I am, as I said, I'm a proponent of psychotherapy. I have a lot of people, psychologists, report to me at Cornell who are psychotherapists, and I respect the discipline very much. But this is also in the service of developing some psychotherapies that can be more easily disseminated. The older I get, the more I'm concerned about. In New York, to be frank, only the rich people get good psychotherapy, and I find it bothersome. So the other issue, so we developed a psychotherapy based on principles of neuroplasticity, that reward dysfunction is ubiquitous in depression. And we started in an aging sample. Some of the work I do is within a geriatric center. One of the reasons we start some of these interventions in an aging sample is because of how age influences the system. So individuals, a lot of individuals with depression have reward system inefficiency. Aging also creates an inefficiency in the reward system. So essentially, it's a good place to start, where you're going to have perhaps more of the dysfunction that you're trying to remediate. And then once you start there and can show the efficacy there, then you would move to other age groups and populations. So here I'm basically just showing you that this is in an aging sample. We looked at, one of our instructors looked at the ability to learn from reward, which sounds really boring, but it's really important. So our behavior, our day-to-day behavior is really, it's really guided by the experience of reward. If we do something that's rewarding, we should keep doing it. If it isn't rewarding, we should stop and shift. So this is basically a reward learning task where people had to shift. When they got individuals in the blue, what it shows is that when people were as people get older, if they get negative feedback in response to reward, their brains are less efficient in processing that feedback and shifting their behavior. So this is just an example of why we would, it's this idea that this may be compounded, the reward issues may be compounded in older depressed individuals. So the principles of this psychotherapy are basically, the basis of it is in reward exposure. And it's a stepped psychotherapy. The initial 4 sessions are designed to target barriers are designed to increase people's experience to reward. It's a behavioral activation approach to a large degree. By the 4th session, if people are not improving, then the therapist is looking at potential barriers. And the potential barriers that we've identified are also very tied to neuroscience and to the brain. One may be apathy, or a simple lack of interest in pursuing rewards. One may be inadequate emotion regulation or disruption in the cognitive control system. And another barrier that we identified that the therapist may target is this really negative self-referential thinking. And if you see patients, you've all seen this. These are the people who, depressed people tend to be ruminative and anxious and pretty treatment resistant. and they just see themselves in the world as in a very negative way, and it's hard to shake that. So again, the initial phase of this is based on reward exposure. If the reward exposure is working, the therapists go with it. If it doesn't appear to be working within the first few sessions, they do look to start targeting these other potential barriers. So this just briefly describes the reward exposure. It's very structured. Select a meaningful activity. Could be social or physical, other, set a goal, work with the therapist would work with the individual on ideas for meeting the goal, settle on the idea, list steps of an action plan, and then check in as far as how did it go. So what we've found with this, and the other reason that we're even focused on this is we're training community providers to give this. So it's not just, we're not focusing this trial on PhD level psychologists and psychotherapists. We're focusing this on people who are not as highly trained. What we found from the initial, this was not a randomized sample. What we found from the initial sample is that in a non-randomized analysis, that this reward-based exposure that can be done by community clinicians is equal in improving depression as the gold standard psychotherapy, a CBT-based approach in older adults, and that the level of disability improved to the same degree. Interestingly, and I think many of you, if anybody who focuses in older adults knows that, you'll hear people talk about this phenomenon of loneliness. And what we found is actually that when we broke down the engaging activities, that the effect really seems to be driven in large part by people who are engaging in social activities. So that may offer us a more targeted, a more refined target for the intervention. I'm not ready to show you the graph yet. We do have a center grant right now that George Alexopoulos is the PI of, and in which we have moved this really into community settings. So we've moved this engaged psychotherapy into senior centers. It's being delivered in a group format, and the preliminary efficacy looks good. And these are low income, mostly in low income areas. We've also moved it in. We had Superstorm Sandy some years ago in New York, and a lot of the boroughs were really devastated by this, and the mental health care has been sort of atrocious. So we teamed up with the New York City Department of Aging, and we have shown some efficacy in delivering this really in a community setting. So sometimes not even in like a clinic, but really more out in the community with survivors of that who are suffering from depression. We have another collaborator who has started to implement this using peer support, and the final results of that randomized control trial is not in, but the results are quite promising. And the final thing we're doing with this psychotherapy is that we are now, and this is driven by George Alexopoulos because he's the PI of this center grant. We are reducing the number of in-person sessions. So right now this therapy is in person. Sometimes it's in person in a fast food restaurant. We're targeting some victims of elder abuse as well, and so going into the home is not an option. So our clinicians and staff are really creative about where they'll see people. But we are working on reducing the number of in-person sessions, so reducing the cost and the burden. And where approximately half of the sessions will be done online. Not in an app or a video game, but at online, internet-based psychotherapy. So we have some, so I showed you example of two interventions that are neuroscience informed and taking very different approaches, but both may improve access to care and provide more targeted interventions that are based on brain circuitry to a large degree. I would say some of our ongoing challenges, and we all know this, we have a trial and error approach to treatment that leaves many of our patients suffering for prolonged periods of time. And again, as a neuropsychologist, I've always wanted, I thought we would be able to find some scale, some questionnaire, some cognitive tasks that may be able to really tell us on an individual level who could be, would be best suited for which treatment. I don't think we've done that yet. And it's not for lack of trying. I think we at the group level, we've done that. So that this trial and error approach and how we assign people to treatment is still quite challenging. Our efficacious treatments, the good ones, still only tend to work for half our patients. So I do think we need to find a way of improving upon our trial and error approach and how we select people for treatments, and also at the same time compensate for the dearth of providers. So I am not a proponent of replacing our qualified providers. I feel very strongly that we will never have enough providers. I think our expert clinicians, like at Cornell, I think our expert clinicians should be developing programs. They should be overseeing the provision of psychotherapy, maybe seeing some of the most complicated cases, but we can never meet the demand. At Cornell, like one of our clinics, we just simply shut off, we don't shut off the phones, but there is an enrollment period and then it stops. So we're really not, we're able to train our residents and our psychology trainees, we're really not able to keep up with any kind of flow of treating the community. So this is one of my more controversial approaches that I'll mention, and then we can stop and do the questions and have time for discussion. So this is the collaboration I mentioned with my colleague, a fantastic psychiatrist and true translational neuroscientist, Dr. Connor Liston, and Toronto was involved in this work as well. So our typical way of looking for subtypes of any psychiatric condition in order to drive how we treat individuals is by looking at the symptom profile and then looking at the neurophysiologic or the more neurobiologic correlates of that, and then somehow using that information to determine what treatment to use. This has been successful to some degree. It hasn't gotten us as far as I think we should be as far as being able to understand the patient at an individual level. So what Connor did with the help of one of our super talented residents, Andrew Drysdale, and in collaboration with a lot of other people focused in depression, he did this massive, before data sharing was really cool, he did this massive data sharing effort where he went around the US and Toronto and asked people if they would share their resting state fMRI data with him. So he could do a data-driven, in part based in machine learning approach to look to see within depression if we could identify subtypes that might be able to inform our treatment development and selection. So he was successful in this, and it resulted in this, which within the neuroimaging world was a very high profile and controversial paper. And what he found, and I'll walk you through this, is these are basically, on the top row, these are correlation matrices that essentially show patterns of connectivity, not connectivity in the brain, not connectivity between one region and the next, but this is a matrix of 258 regions that have been identified by Jonathan Power and others from WashU. And what I want you to take away from here is that if you look, and I've looked at these a lot, so they look very different to me. I'm not sure how different they looked at first. But what you can see here, so these cool colors mean there's a negative correlation between regions. The hot colors mean there are positive correlations. What you can see among these four subtypes or biotypes is the pattern of correlations are quite different. And what's important about this, there are a few take-home points from this. So the brain differs. The connectivity patterns differ. But then when you look down at the symptom profiles, and this was based on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, because this is the scale that everybody had, or almost everybody had. It's not just that the connectivity patterns differed, but that these connectivity patterns mapped onto different symptom profiles, all within depression. So varying degrees of anxiety and anhedonia and sleep disturbance, and you can see that these differ across these four, what we have sort of been forced to call biotypes or subtypes, if you will. What's even more important about this, and what we became very interested in about, and this is the data that was provided to us by Toronto, by Jonathan Downer and his group, is that, and I don't have this slide to show you, but two of these biotypes respond really well to stimulation of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And that using some of the algorithms and the computational approach that Connor has developed, we can predict on an individual level what subtype somebody belongs to based on their MRI scan. And even if we analyze this in a newer sample, and we can predict with very high accuracy in the 90s on an individual level how likely they'll respond to TMS and which stimulation sites. So that's the grant that we're pursuing, that we're going to start as soon as we get through the regulatory aspects. So we started this approach with TMS for a couple of reasons. One, it's a more direct intervention to the brain, or it appears to be. So we also had pilot data to support it, and enough data to support that we think this might work. So this trial that we're starting soon, it will be the pivotal trial of this. And with the idea is that this would be the first approach of using neuroimaging to guide selection of treatment on an individual basis. If the pivotal trial is successful, and we replicate the previous findings, then we'll go through the FDA to try to get this method. And it's essentially, it's a computational method cleared so it can be used in a clinical setting. So we are farther along in this area with neurostimulation or the transcranial magnetic version of neurostimulation. One of our next endeavors may be to try to apply this kind of approach to psychotherapy. Again, TMS made the most sense to start with, but I think, and we can discuss this, as we've been getting this work reviewed, and I had the same thought. Again, this took me 2 years. I worked with Connor. He's a wonderful collaborator, super smart, really nice human being. And so I liked writing with him. I didn't actually believe the clinical utility of it until I saw multiple data sets, and they're impressive. So now I think we're onto something, and I think it's something that we actually may be able to finally move FMRI into the clinic. And I've been doing FMRI research since the early 90s, and since it came out, really. And I really never thought that was possible, except for maybe in epilepsy. So it's a really exciting area. there's a lot still to be determined. One question that often comes up about this, and I think it's a bias that we should, in psychiatry, should be moving away from, is people will immediately say, it's too expensive. And the fact is, people use imaging in every other area of medicine, right? For difficult cases, for diagnosis, to guide treatment. And the cost of an MRI scan, it may not be able to be used everywhere, but the cost of an MRI scan and using this algorithm in comparison to the cost of a year of poorly treated depression it's minuscule. So I'm not saying that I think we need neuroimaging necessarily to guide all our treatment decisions, but with some cases it actually might make sense. And the jury's still out about psychotherapy and how we may be able to use this to guide psychotherapy treatments, or the question about psychotherapy versus antidepressant medication, that's the other question. So a couple of other future directions I'll mention is, we have this, I think this really promising digital therapeutic to improve cognitive control function and associated syndromes. What would be really great, and I think is challenging, is to develop one that targets reward systems, because think about within psychiatry, think about the conditions that really seem to be a disruption in large part in reward systems. It's not just depression. Think about addiction and the dysfunction there. So eating disorders. The final areas, I think, and Toronto also has they're really known for some of their neurostimulation work, the non-invasive neurostimulation work. I do think some of these non-invasive approaches, what may make sense for people who don't respond to a first line, either psychotherapy, psychosocial intervention, or first line of a non-invasive neurostimulation intervention, may be to combine the two. And with the idea that we are taking advantage of neuroplasticity to augment the effect of these interventions. So I do think that's one area that may be potentially very productive. So with that, thank you for your attention.
We now have time for questions and answers. We have a break after, so we can go a few minutes into the break. There are 2 microphones in the room, so if you could migrate over to the microphone, and we'll probably have some online questions as well. And we'll open with our colleague from Ottawa.
Hello, I'm Sanjay Rao from University of Ottawa. My question, everything was excellent, but my question, you covered many interventions, but my question is about the engagement intervention. Now, you've trialed it against PST, but the theoretical models are different. One is based on self-efficacy and another is based on rewards. So as a clinician, it would be easier for us, and I know because in seniors population, PST has been trialed, but given that behavioral activation is the first line intervention and has both avoidance management and reward management, it would be nice to see if reward management itself is a sufficient component, because most BA people are doing avoidance management and less of the reward management. So trialing them together would give us a more easier way to then translate it to community.
So thank you for that point. So I think the way this intervention is designed is the first 4 weeks are really based on reward management. So looking at that, looking where we are after that first 4 weeks would be important. I do want to, I wanted to make one comment as the group struggled with the technology, is that, I think, and this isn't directly related to your question, but I think what it demonstrates is that when we're thinking about how we target different groups with the use of technology, we really have to make it user-friendly, and it may vary based on age, on socioeconomic status, but as the people working on this, we have to be very aware of making it very easy to use and providing the support necessary. Otherwise, it will fail. So we'll go on. Yes.
Professor, and if there are people online who are watching through the webcast and you have questions, you can send that to us and we'll take those questions as well. Professor?
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I completely embrace your idea of mechanistically informed psychological therapies. My question is related to that. I have two questions. Firstly, with the video games, I was just intrigued by what difference there is between this particular video game and pretty much any other video game that is also very engaging. I mean, is there a mechanistically different response, for example, to the gaming and therefore the impact it has on cognitive function? And the second one was, there is such a large body of evidence on brief psychological therapies at work. For example, BA, we just heard the previous questioner. Would it be also worthwhile to examine the mechanistic basis of those established treatments to understand how do neurocognitive mechanisms mediate those treatment effects alongside perhaps developing brand new ones?
Yeah, so to your first question, the primary difference in this therapeutic video game is that it is specifically designed to target this multitasking function, and which is supported by the cognitive control network. So it was, based in animal models of neuroplasticity, and then models in older adults of how to train the cognitive control system. So, and that combined with the gaming principles and the individualization, I do think that's what makes it stand out from a lot of the other interventions. And the other thing that stands out is many of the other video games or cognitive training interventions, they really haven't been adequately tested yet. So we don't know yet, although they're being marketed, but they haven't been tested. I will say in the next phase of this trial, which I didn't mention, we're starting the randomized part where people will be randomized either to the cognitive control-based intervention or another intervention that is equally as engaging, unfortunately maybe a little bit more engaging, but is not as targeted to the cognitive control network. So it's an empirical question from that standpoint. As far as studying the existing interventions, including things like, or pre-psychological interventions, and understanding their mechanisms, absolutely, I agree with you that that should be part of the focus, because the better we understand the mechanisms, in my opinion, the better we're able to target them to our patients.
Next question.
My question's actually very similar. So I guess we can let go. The first was if there's a comparable game, maybe available through Lumosity or something like that. Just, I was trained as an occupational therapist many years ago, and I've always been taught that cognitive drawings don't have sufficient evidence. So we've always practiced compensatory strategies for people in our mood and anxiety clinic, where we treat people with depression and a lot of cognitive concerns related to depression. So I guess we don't know if there's a comparable game, because I want to have to offer. I teach mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which gets a default default mode network, and we do see improvements according to research in both sustained cognitive function. I don't know if it's executive function specifically, but definitely sustained attention and some memory improvement, and also depressive symptoms as well. But I would way rather play a video game than sit and meditate daily for an hour. So with regard to, I guess, adherence and implementation, I could see the huge benefit. But I'm just curious if you looked at comparing the two interventions.
We haven't done a direct comparison. I'm not aware of another intervention that seems has as much evidence base for it. And I also having been in rehab medicine, I also sort of grew up with that idea is that to take the compensatory approach. And in rehab medicine, it may be a combination of both as better tools become available. The mindfulness-based interventions or the simple meditations, those are some of our next steps as well, is to try some of these other interventions, maybe targeting anxiety and some of the cognitive symptoms of anxiety. So I think your approach makes sense.
First, thanks for a very informative presentation, a novel subject really for me. But my question is, would you think this video game intervention or any form of neurostimulation, does it have a primary or a secondary therapeutic role in treating depression? I mean, do you believe that they directly affect depression at some neurological level and its symptoms, or they just generally enhances the cognitive capability of the person, their cognitive functioning, and then they can benefit better from the other aspects of therapeutic intervention? Because in that case, the implication is this video game intervention must be followed by a form of cognitive therapy or some other therapy. It cannot be an independent treatment per se, as it is.
So I will speculate here. I do think we have evidence to show that in some individuals, and we don't know who exactly yet, I do think that we have enough evidence to suggest it may be useful as a primary intervention for some, because it's changing the brain, and it's changing the brain in such a way that that brain change is probably what's improving the depression. So it's not just a cognitive change, it's a change in the functioning of the underlying circuitry that's contributing to depression. And then I know I sound like I'm hedging, but I think for other individuals, it may not be a standalone, and it may be an augmentation for people who are already being treated, or maybe in combination. And I don't think, we're not quite there yet to dissociate that. We haven't done large enough trials in depression yet to understand that. But I actually believe it can be a primary intervention for some people with depression.
Next question, and feel free to introduce yourself as you ask the question.
Hi, my name's Sonia Dillon, and I'm almost a PhD candidate at U of T in clinical psychology. And I study
Fabulous.
something very similar to you, so depression, neuropsychological factors, in young people with depressive symptoms, as well as the differences in older adults with or without mild cognitive impairment. So short of asking or begging you to be on my dissertation committee as an external examiner.
I always say yes, by the way.
Okay, good to know. I'll call my supervisor at the break. But I was just curious, in the first part of your presentation, it seemed that there were gains across the board using this video game. So increased connectivity in the network, objective measures of neuropsychological performance on these executive function tasks also improved, as well as the subjective cognitive measured by the Frisbee. Did you see, or can you comment on the magnitude of those gains? Is there a difference between those three, or is there a kind of a objective versus subjective difference in the magnitude of improvement?
I will say we haven't looked at it yet. But that's an interesting question, because those don't always hang together that well, right? So it would be an interesting question to look
great.
at.
Thank you.
And good luck with your dissertation.
We've time for a few more questions, and there's a queue. If we could keep the questions a bit shorter.
I won't introduce myself because I'm going to be doing that in a few minutes. Thank you so much. That was a very exciting presentation about how changing the mind can change the brain. I found your mentioning of in the behavioral activation intervention, the social behavioral activation seemed to be something important towards recovery. And I'm just wondering about looking at the social brain and reflective functioning as another target, and interventions that might then specifically address that.
I feel like you were planted in the audience to ask that question. So that is a project that we're starting now, where we're specifically focused on social reward and understanding that better, both in the brain and how specifically in aging, but how we can use that to augment interventions. We're thinking along the same lines.
Great. And I also was curious whether your biotypes, whether you have looked at it in the opposite direction, because you've got HAM-D kind of patterns, and whether that, if you just look at that, how closely do you predict the neuroimaging biotypes that you found? Because it's much less costly if you just look at HAM-Ds.
So we have not, my understanding is we have not been terribly successful in the opposite direction. We are looking to integrate clinical measures with neuroimaging, and in some populations, I do think it may make sense if we can find a behavioral measure like the HAM-D that really gives us individual level prediction. That would be optimal. I don't think we haven't gotten there yet, though.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for your exciting presentation. I'm Shadi. I'm an international medical graduate from Iran, and also I did my master's at University of Toronto. And my master's project was about using online mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for family caregivers of dementia patients. So it was a technology-based intervention. My question is a practical one. I was thinking using a technology-based intervention in a population of elderly who I assume are not as technology-driven as, like, let's say, teenager population. Did you face any resistance or difficulty regarding recruiting patients into your project?
So in this population, we did not. And I think the main reason for that is because the people who were coming to us also were suffering and reporting that they had executive dysfunction. They didn't call it that. They also had failed. Many of them in the second trial had failed first-line treatments. So they really wanted the intervention. So it is a different population. And we made it quite easy and provided support for them.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, my name's Pauline Pitka. I'm a psychiatrist,
Hi.
Psychotherapist in Hamilton. And I had two short questions. One was, I had heard about Super Mario being a game that had been tested quite a bit to improve functioning in gray matter in seniors, and I didn't know if you had any familiarity with that.
Not enough to answer a question.
Okay.
Accurately.
And the other one is, and I'm sorry if I may have missed it in your presentation because of my gray matter perhaps, but you were talking about following up over 8 weeks. Have you had any long-term follow-up for the sustainability of the testing?
So the initial study of this that was done at UCSF in aging, there was a 6-month follow-up, but we have not had the long-term follow-up, to my knowledge, not in the studies I've been involved in, with depression. So that we clearly need to do.
And the people that you had, were they depression naive prior, or had they been previously treated, or did you?
A mix.
Okay.
And some they really bordered on being treatment resistant, so they weren't naive.
Sure. We're out of time. Let's take a 10-minute break and start at 10:30 sharp. And just before we take our break, a quick round of applause for a very, very interesting presentation. Thank you, Professor.